Welcome to our final month of music theory. We will have one more month of music history. This is going to be our final month of theory. This month we're going to continue to look at seventh chords. We're going to talk about inversions of seventh chords and how we symbolize those inversions, as well as looking at lead sheet symbols, which are also sometimes referred to as pop symbols. So those will be our main topics for this month. So without any further ado, let's get going. First of all, talking about inversions of chords. So up until now, we've been notating all the chords with the root as the lowest note. So if we're playing a G major triad, that G would always be on the bottom. However, in a musical context, any part of a chord might appear as the lowest note. You can see that here in this example of this F major chord, where the first one we have F is the lowest note with the A and the C above it. In our next one, we have the A as the lowest note with the C and the F above it. And then we have the same chord with the C as the lowest note with the F and the A above it. You can sort of hear that they do sound a little bit different from each other, but they are essentially the same chord, and that we would label all of them as an F major chord, but we want to give a little bit more context. So here in this example were three different bass positions of a triad that would be named F major. The bass position that we've been using with the root as the lowest tone, or in the bass, is called root position. So that once again, if you have the root of the chord as the lowest tone, that is called root position. You might assume that third position would be the term for a chord with the third as the lowest note, but of course that is not the case that it would be, because musical terminology is fraught with inconsistencies. Instead, this position is called first inversion. So if we have our chord and we have our, let's say that it's a 1, a 3, and a 5, if the 1 is the bottom note, lowest note, that is root position. If the third is the lowest note, that is in first inversion. And then reasonably enough, second inversion is used for chords with the fifth as the lowest note. So looking at that example again on the screen, we have root position as our first one, first inversion as our second one, and second inversion as our third one, as we can see here. The term inversion is used here to mean the transfer of the lowest note to some higher octave. So in our next example, all the chords are first inversion F major chords. Notice that the upper chords can be spaced in any way without altering the bass position. Also, any of the notes can be duplicated or doubled in different octaves. So we're looking at this first inversion F major chord. So we're looking to see that the A is the lowest note present. So by looking at the first bar, we can very easily see that is the exact same chord that we had in our previous example. In the next bar, the A has moved down an octave, and in our right hand or in the treble clef, we have a C, an F, and another C. But that A is the lowest note, so that is also first inversion. In the third bar, we have many more notes. We have going from the bottom, an A, an F, a C, an F, a C, an F, and an A. So that speaks to that idea of doubling in a very serious way. But once again, the A is the lowest note, and therefore it is a first inversion chord. And then in our fourth example, it's really, really spaced out. The A is still in the bass, so it's still going to be a first inversion chord. But the next note, the C, is over an octave away from it. It is, a tenth away from it. And the same can be said for the F above that. Or that one's actually an 11th. So the inversion of seventh chords works just like the inversion of triads, except that there's 3 inversions because there's 4 different notes and therefore 4 possible bass positions. So here we have the example of a C7 chord. This is just our regular C7 because it does not have a B flat. So our root position chord looks like a stack of thirds. Our second position chord takes that C, it moves it up an octave, but because we have that added seventh, it looks a little bit different. For our second inversion, we move the E up an octave as well, so now we have 2 in the original position with the 5th as the bottom note. And then finally, third inversion, we have the 3 notes of our triad above that 7th of the chord. It's important to understand that the inversions of a triad or 7th chord is determined only by what number of the chord is in the bass. Any chord members may appear in the soprano or in other voicings without changing the inversion. So, as we look at this, it isn't very elegant to have to say first inversion, second inversion, third inversion, and how do I know comparing a triad to a 7th chord? Well, they've devised a system of symbols to denote what they're trying to ask for. So in analyzing music, we often use numbers to indicate the bass position of the chord. Instead of using 1 for first inversion or 2 for second inversion and so on, we use numbers derived from the Baroque system called figured bass. During the Baroque period, which was approximately from about 1600 to 1750, the keyboard player in an ensemble read from a part consisting only of a bass line and some symbols indicating the chord to be played. So you would just have your left hand that was written out, and then there would be numbers above that note to tell you what you should be playing. In the Baroque system, the symbols consisted basically of numbers representing intervals above the bass to be formed by the members of the chord, but the notes could actually be played in any octave above the bass. I'll explain that more in just 1 second. The system dealt only with intervals, not with roots of chords, because the theory of chord roots had not been devised when figured bass was first developed. So here in this table, it's illustrated the figured bass symbols for root position and inverted and in 7th chords for a G major triad and a G major minor 7th. So we can see here that when we have a root position triad, what they would have put in the figured bass symbol was a 5 and a 3. Because what you would be telling the player is, if you see this G, you want to play a 3rd above it and a 5th above it. In our modern day system, we do not bother putting in 5-3. If a chord is in root position and it is a triad, all that you have to say in this case is G or G major. And we know what the root is because it is in the bass. Before I go any further, notice that with the first one, our root position triad, and the fourth one, our root position seventh chord, they do look like thirds just stacked on top of each other. But when we look at the inversions of the others, they look a little bit more disjointed in how they're lined up. Anyways, the second chord, which is our first inversion triad, this time in the figured bass system, they would have written a 6 and a 3. Because if we go up from that B to D is a third. And then if we go from that B to that G, that is a sixth. In our system of triads, because we had that third previously, they imply it. And so to say that a triad is in first inversion, we would write a 6. So a G major 6. This is not pop cymbals. And that sixth tells us that there's a sixth above the bass note. And that is our root. Finally, our second position triad, we can see that from that D to that G is a 4, a fourth, and from that D to that B is a sixth. So in the figured bass system, they would have written 6, 4. And to specify that it's different from our 6, 3, we would also write 6, 4 with the 6 over the 4. Our root position seventh chord, all we have to write is a seventh, because that will tell us that we have to add the 7. If you don't have that seventh there, that is telling the person that it is a triad, not a seventh chord. Our first inversion seventh chord, in the figured bass system, they would have called this a 6, 5, 3 because there's an interval a third above, a fifth above, and a sixth above. But in this case, we will omit the 3 to simplify it because there is not another interval with a sixth and a fifth. So we call this a 6, 5. Our second inversion seventh chord has some of the same intervals as our second inversion triad. So instead of calling it a 6, 4 or a 6, 4, 3, we simplify that by calling it a 4, 3, because there is a fourth and a third above the bass note. And then finally, our third inversion seventh chord has a second, a fourth, and a sixth above the bass note. Once again, we already have a 6, 4, so 6, 4 would be confusing. We call this one a 4, 2. You can always count sort of the intervals, but the best thing is just to work on memorizing what each one of those are, to know that sixth is a first inversion triad, 6, 4 is a second inversion triad, 7 is a root position seventh chord, 6, 5 is a first inversion seventh chord, 4, 3 is a second inversion seventh chord, and 4, 2 is a third inversion seventh chord. So in the figured bass system, the number 6 designates a sixth above the bass. Whether it is a major sixth or a minor sixth depends on the key signature. If the Baroque composer wished to direct the keyboard player to raise or lower a note, there were several methods that could be used, including these following three. So an accidental next to an Arabic number in the figured bass could be used to raise a note. So here we have a D, and underneath, if it said 4-3, we would know that that's a second inversion seventh chord. But what happens if you want that root note to be raised? You could just put a sharp next to the note that it attends to. An accidental by itself always referred to the third pitch the third above the bass. So here we have an E major chord, or just an E chord. We have nothing in the key signature, so that would say that it's an E minor chord. But if you put a sharp and just a sharp, that implies that you are raising the third, which would make that one, in this case, an E major chord. Also, a slash or a plus sign in connection with an Arabic numeral meant to raise the note. So both putting that slash through the 6 and the plus sign after the 4 resulted in the same thing happening in each, where they get raised a semitone. This example here illustrates a portion of an actual figured bass part from the Baroque period, along with a possible realization that would have been improvised by the keyboardist. Some keyboard players may have added embellishments not shown in this realization. Bach included the numeral 5 at several places to remind the player to play a root position triad. So first, hear the bass line as written, and then listen to a possible realization of those figured bass symbols. The realization of figured basses is still considered to be an effective way to learn certain aspects of tonal composition, and we will occasionally use this in the future years. The inversion symbols that we use today are summarized in this table. These symbols are usually used with a Roman numeral, such as 1-6 or 5-6-5, as part of a harmonic analysis. Don't worry too much about Roman numerals right now. We'll talk about those in the future. Notice that when a seventh chord is inverted, the 7 is replaced by the appropriate inversion symbol. So 7 is replaced by 6-5 or 4-3 or 4-2. Finally, let's link these to lead sheet symbols or pop symbols. If you are wanting to play guitar and read the symbols that they have on the page, that is what we're talking about. So there are some intriguing parallels and contrasts between the figured bass system of the 17th and 18th centuries and the lead sheet symbols or pop symbols developed for use with jazz and other types of popular music in the 20th and 21st centuries. Both facilitated the notation process and served to provide sufficient information to allow the performer to improvise within certain bounds. However, whereas the figured bass system provided the bass line with symbols indicating the chords that were to be constructed above it, the lead sheet symbols appear along with a melody and indicate the chords that are to be constructed below the melody. There are various lead sheet symbol systems in use, just as there were frequent minor differences between the approaches taken by the different composers to the use of figured bass symbols. Nevertheless, the system you see here is quite widely used today and would be understood by any competent jazz or pop musician. This example illustrates the 4 triad types and the 5 common 7th chords with their associated pop symbols. Under each chord, you'll find the symbol introduced in the previous examples, and under each of these is the lead sheet symbol. With the exception of the half diminished 7th, there is a clear correlation between the two systems. So here we see that this E capital M for major, we just call that a capital E to say that it's E major. When we have a minor chord, we still have that capital E, but then we have a lowercase m next to it to say that it's minor. When we see a diminished chord, we would write dim afterwards. Or when we see an augmented chord, we would write a plus sign for augmented afterwards. When it comes to 7th chords, our E7 is not our major 7. It is our major minor 7 because in jazz, so much of jazz is based off of dominant 7th chords, which are major minor 7th chords. So it is just E7. Therefore, our E major 7, we want to put a capital M between the E and the 7. Our minor 7, we put that lowercase m. Our diminished 7, we put that dim 7. The difference here when we have that half diminished 7 is because we have a E minor 7, if you compare it to the one before it, the only difference is they have flattened the 5. So they write an E minor 7 with a flat 5, which is a little bit different than what we're used to. So in this list, it is incomplete because there are some chords that will be introduced later on. A special case is the chord with an added 6th, as in the C6, which calls for a triad with an added note, a major 6th above the root. Also, lead sheet symbols will occasionally specify a particular bass note, such as C/G, or we would say C over G, which calls for a C major triad over a G in the bass, or a triad in second inversion. Finally, you may discover that lead sheet symbols frequently differ from one edition to the next because editors and arrangers routinely make substitutions, simplifying or complicating the harmony as they see fit. Finally, from the beginning of the typical American standard ballad, Autumn Leaves, and it uses 5 of the chord types found in the previous example. Notice that the flat in the F sharp minor flat 5 does not literally mean to flat the 5th, but to lower it from C sharp to C natural. So here we'll hear the melody of Autumn Leaves and then add in some chords underneath it to give you an idea. After that, please do your written work for this month. Thanks so much.